Oftentimes on this channel, we are quite skeptical of the professional activists in the LGBTQ XXIIP elemental JJJJY community. And the reason why we are skeptical of them is because often they're just pointing out things that are other people exercising their rights and trying to censor and trying to wield their political power against people that say things, again, that they just disagree with. And sometimes they're not even saying these things in earnest. Perfect example of this, Dave Chappelle comedy special really angers the LGBT, the transes, and all those people, even though he's just exercising his freedom of speech, and a lot of what he's doing is just joking. More recently, Ricky Gervais has come under fire for a similar topic, and of course, we talked about recently about how Bill Maher pointed out that the LGBTQ people are going a little bit crazy in this nation. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't struggles. That doesn't mean that there aren't bad rulings and bad decisions that clearly hurt that community beyond the individual cases. And what we're going to talk about today is a case involving a former Virginia Tech athlete who beat somebody to death and was able to get off due to a gay panic defense. No, I'm not kidding. This happened quite recently, and that's why I want to discuss it. But before we get into this topic, which is extra serious, we are sponsored in this video. So we're going to go into the sponsorship, then we're going to come back and talk about this on the other side. Drones used to be toys, gimmicks, nothing that special, but now they're used in every big budget movie. They're used by videographers, they're used by YouTube vloggers, and that's because they give you a perspective that you don't normally get. There's a reason why Russia is actually banning and shooting down video drones, because they're so effective in capturing what's going on from a near unbiased perspective. And if you want to get yourself a drone, I highly recommend you go over to flymitydrone.com and get yourself one of these tactical drones. They're really awesome, lightweight, portable. They got a 4K camera so you can capture crisp images. They shoot all the way up to 60p if you like that slow motion stuff. And again, you can get them for 50% off at flymitydrone.com. Let's give this a little bit of a test flight so you can see how awesome it is. I'm sure it won't go disastrously in my room, which is in a small apartment in New York. That's flymitydrone.com to get your own.
Tonight in Montgomery County, a jury found a former Virginia Tech football player not guilty in the murder of a Blacksburg man. Attorneys argued Isamen Atute acted in self-defense in the death of 40-year-old Jerry Smith, a Tinder date who he originally thought was a woman.
So Isamen Atute is the subject of today's video, and the not guilty verdict in his trial is what we're going to be talking about. But in order to understand this case, you have to understand what the defense that was utilized for this case actually was. So, to be clear, Atute was in fact catfished by a person who 2 weeks prior to the encounter that they initially had was identifying as a gay male on Tinder. This person changed up their profile, started saying that they were a woman, and ended up hooking up with Isamen. That is what happened. They performed oral sex on him. I'm not using they as a gender neutral thing. It was he performed oral sex on him. And after this ultimately ended up occurring, Isamen got it in his head that this person may have been misrepresenting themselves, that this guy was actually not a lady as he intended. And of course, this ultimately turned out to be true. So Isamen and a couple of other athletes from Virginia Tech decided to go over, according to him, and confront this person because they believe this person to be a man. Now, whenever a story like this comes up in the news, I always think of the creator Blair White, because Blair has talked about multiple different times how if she's sitting at a bar and somebody orders her a drink because they find her attractive, she goes out of her way to tell that person that she is in fact a transgender individual. And the reason that Blair says that she does this is because she's worried about a horrible reaction, not maybe as bad as this one, but any reaction that could put Blair in danger. And I totally understand this, and I'm not one of those people who's going to be like, well, if you got caught in this situation, then that person did nothing wrong, haha for you, or anything like that. I think that if you do get caught in this situation, if you do get catfished, you do have a right to be angry. You do have a right to be upset. You do have a right to maybe pursue criminal charges, although the idea that you can't like deceive somebody into a sexual encounter, there's a weird line on that situation. And considering I, as a single man, would tell people that I was a multi-billionaire in order to get them to talk to me, then I wouldn't want a law that ironclad bars you from not telling the truth in these scenarios. That being said, what your response should be in a situation like this, if you received oral sex from somebody that you thought was a woman and was in fact a man, is not violence. Your response should be to not tell other people. This guy told his teammates, so they all gathered up as a group to go confront this person, and somebody ultimately ended up dying, when a much more rational response would have been not to confront Jerry Paul Smith in this way and beat him to death. It would have been to, not talk about this, not tell everybody in your friend group about this, and kind of let this instance go. It doesn't reflect poorly on you if you got tricked. You could just let it go. Don't be ridiculous. Don't be insane. But unfortunately, that is not what happened. So during the course of time, after he found out or became suspicious of whether or not this person was a man, which of course was true, and this man did do something wrong in that instance, he decided that he was going to go confront this person. So they drove 45 minutes to this person's apartment, and he got into the apartment, and things got violent. Now, according to the prosecution, according to the medical examiner used in this case, this was not a fight. Even though the jury ultimately sided with Atute based on a self-defense argument, this just wasn't a fight. This was a total massacre. The Jerry Paul Smith guy, what happened to him, how his face, how his body was destroyed in this beating is unbelievable. I'm actually not going to read you all the vicious graphic details of this, but needless to say, there was bleeding in his brain, he had broken teeth, and at some point he was swallowing so much blood that created the appearance of a different fluid that happens when blood gets into the lungs of somebody. So at points during the course of this beating, Jerry Paul Smith was drowning on his own blood, and yet the jury ultimately ended up finding Atute not guilty. Now, a lot of times when we hear about a not guilty case in a self-defense case, we get a lot of misinformation from one side of the political spectrum on why that occurred. Specifically, the one that I'm thinking of, and you guys all know it, is the Kyle Rittenhouse case, and we get example after example of people lying about the circumstances of the case in order to say that Kyle got off based on his white supremacy or because he was white, even though everybody involved in that instance for the most part was white, the people who died, the person who was wounded, and obviously the case is covered on video, wire to wire. I've gone over it a million times, and it is the clearest, most obvious self-defense case ever because we have the footage of it from every possible angle. However, this case, I'm not joking, rested in part on the gay panic defense. For those of you who are unfamiliar, who are uninitiated, there was a time in this nation where you could use the gay panic defense in order to justify violence up to the point where you kill somebody because you were put into a situation where you as a man had your sexuality questioned. And in the state of Virginia, they've actually passed a law barring this defense from being used in a court of law. However, this law was actually put into effect after the circumstances of this case went down. Now, I need to make this abundantly clear. It is a specific blunder by the legislature in the state of Missouri that made this a not guilty verdict. Even though they passed the law that barred this defense from being used at trial before the crime was committed on May 31st of 2021, they decided that the law wasn't going to come into effect until July 1st of that year. So that little delay, that slight window, is what is determinative of whether or not he was going to be convicted of murder in this case. And it's ridiculous. All they had to do was say effective immediately. All they had to do was say effective upon the governor's signature. So in this trial, at a key procedural ruling, the judge had no choice but to enforce the previous law because you can't retroactively apply laws in this nation. So during the instruction phase, the jury was in fact permitted to consider these options when they were in the jury room weighing whether or not they were going to find Atute guilty of second-degree murder, which, by the way, second-degree murder is a heat of passion murder. You take some premeditated actions, like driving 45 minutes to confront somebody, you get really angry, and you do something like beat them to death. Another thing that factored into this case, or factored and played into the gay panic defense, was the testimony of a detective brought forward by the prosecution and the stunning cross-examination from Turk, the lawyer for Atute. Now, whatever you think about the gay panic defense, I actually think it's ridiculous. Set that aside for a second, because you gotta appreciate good lawyering. During the course of interviewing this detective, who was one of the people who saw the body, the horrific state that it was in, who was involved in the case, he actually got the detective to acknowledge that this sexual encounter that preceded this was under false pretenses. This was considered a gigantic win for the defense. Because imagine if you're on the jury, you have a case that is absolutely horrific. The facts, the major facts of the case, aren't really disputed by either side. The state of Jerry Paul Smith's body after this vicious beatdown is not in dispute. But here's the detective who worked the crime scene, who's describing the horror show that was the crime scene, even acknowledging that Jerry Paul Smith wasn't a good person. Jerry Small Smith did something deceptive, and that leads in perfectly to the defense being put forward by Turk. Now, before I get accused of leaving crucial details out, there was another component to the self-defense case that ultimately ended up resulting in positive jury instructions for the defendant, and that was the presence of a knife in this situation. So it turns out that during the course of the testimony from Atute, that the guy reached under his pillow at some point, and when the police were examining the crime scene, they found out that there was a knife vaguely in that direction, although it doesn't appear that there's any actual evidence that this person reached for the knife, drew the knife, or that Atute had any expectation that there was a knife there. Also, the testimony from Atute about him reaching under the pillow and how he was afraid he was grabbing a gun was not in his initial statement to police, because he did talk to the police at the time. So it was only after the fact, when they discovered the knife, did he say anything about the reaching, but when he first talked to the police, no reaching to be found, to give you an idea of how legitimate this argument is. And the prosecution wanted this not factored into the self-defense instructions, but the defense insisted that this be included because you have the presence of a deadly weapon, and what the judge did in this case is not like what he did in the gay panic defense part of the case, because the fact of the matter is the gay panic thing was in Virginia law. It was in effect. You may not like it, you may disagree with it, even the state of Virginia has gotten rid of it, but at the time you have to apply the applicable laws. So what he did was procedural, and he described it as such. So people criticizing the judge really should be criticizing the legislature for not addressing this sooner, because the judge really had his hands tied. He had to give those instructions to the jury because he had to go based on the law that existed at the time. However, for this one, it was really more of a judgment call. Whether or not this knife actually factored in or not is not really in dispute, in my opinion. It really didn't, but the knife did exist. It was there, but again, you're in the guy's home and you're there to confront him, to beat him to death. So even if he rolled the knife in that situation, he's in his own home and you're coming after him, so whatever. But instead of making that ruling, or instead of making a really strong judgment, what the judge ultimately ended up doing was saying that the presence of the knife should be considered extraordinarily low in terms of the argument for self-defense. And just having it in there, having it present, even though Atute never really said anything about feeling threatened by a knife, he said reaching under the pillow or whatever, actually ended up helping the defense, because you have the gay panic situation, then you have the knife, you have the detective saying that Jerry Paul Smith was deceptive, he got sex under false pretenses, which is in fact true, by the way. I'm not disputing that, that's not disputed by anybody, and that ultimately ended up playing into the instructions that the jury was given related to this trial.
It was a roller coaster of emotions for people in court today. Isimemen Atute is now a free man after a jury found him not guilty of second-degree murder. The jury deliberated for nearly 3.5 hours. After handing down the verdict, Atute and his family immediately started crying and hugging one another.
Now, as you guys know, as I said earlier in this video, Atute was ultimately found not guilty. He was released on the second-degree murder charges, the case is over, and he was free. He was able to use an archaic law that even the state of Virginia has said is outdated and does not need to exist in order to beat the charges related to this murder. Now, that being said, this happened quite recently, and the LGBTQXXIIP community has talked about cases where the judgment was unfair to the gays before. But the thing is, I haven't seen a ton about this. I've seen way more about Ricky Gervais's jokes, Bill Maher's jokes, and about Dave Chappelle's jokes than this actual case, which ultimately ends up bringing up the question of why this actual case of something that was in the law that is clearly biased against the LGBTQXXIIP community led to somebody who I believe is guilty of murder getting off, is not a #1 topic for these people. Maybe because the law has changed, maybe because the makeup of the people in this case don't really fit with other modern progressive narratives. Remember, they added the black and brown stripes to the pride flag to show that race is something that is included in the pride thing now, and this doesn't line up the way people would want it to line up in terms of the races. Now, that's just my speculation. Of course, it is based on my informed opinion, and it's based on my years of covering cases and what makes national news versus what just remains a local story on this channel in front of you guys right here on theinternet.com. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you think that the reason this case isn't getting a lot of attention is because of the fact that this was a black 18-year-old athlete who killed somebody? Or do you think that maybe the gay panic defense should exist in court today? Obviously, you know where I stand on this. I was going to leave things a little bit more ambiguous, but I'm sorry, you can't beat somebody up because they gave you a blowjob and you were surprised about who they were. That is on you for hooking up on Tinder to a certain point. Obviously, they're morally wrong for doing so, but that doesn't give you the right to viciously beat somebody to death, and the court should not be providing, or the state legislature, I don't want to blame the court because the judge hands were tied in this situation. It was purely a procedural maneuver for him at this point. He's not meant to be an activist member of the judiciary, but the legislature passed a stupid law and waited far too long to repeal it, in my mind, and that ultimately led to somebody who viciously beat another man to death getting off for murder scot-free to go resume the rest of his life in a way that Jerry Paul Smith will never be able to do so. But if you disagree with me on that, you are wrong. You're 100% wrong, but I would love to see an informed argument in the comments below for that position, because maybe, just maybe, but definitely not because you would be wrong, there is something that I didn't consider. As usual, if you like this video, you show me by leaving a like. You subscribe for more content. You follow me on all my social medias. You support me via the support links in the description box of this video. This has been me talking about the gay panic defense working. Till next time.